Another somewhat unexpected Nobel Prize for Peace. One individual and two organizations in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, all taking a stand against the power of Vladimir Putin. But do their positions foster peace as the prize intended? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmakers are the Nobel Peace Prize winners. Well, there were lists of favorites from respected publications, but in the end, none of them called this year's winners of the Nobel Peace Prize.
This year's Peace Prize is awarded to human rights advocate Ales Bialiatski from Belarus, the Russian human rights organization Memorial, and the Ukrainian human rights organization Center for Civil Liberties.
Well, all three recipients have one important factor in common: a stance against the Kremlin. In giving the Peace Prize to pro-democracy activists in Belarus, Russia, and Kiev, many say the Norwegian Nobel Committee was sending a clear message, summed up very well by the former executive director of Human Rights Watch, who tweeted, "On Putin's 70th birthday, the Nobel Peace Prize is awarded to a Russian human rights group that Putin shut down, a Ukrainian human rights group that is documenting his war crimes, and a Belarusian human rights activist whom Putin's ally Viktor Lukashenko has imprisoned." Well, unsurprisingly, Putin's advocates are not impressed. In a moment, we'll hear from a former member of the Russian parliament who says today's laureates are not proponents of peace, but rather agents of U.S. intelligence agencies. Now, whether that's believable or not, it echoes other critics of the Nobel Committee. Maung Zarni, a pro-democracy activist from Myanmar, says this year's prize does not promote peace. He tweeted, "I thought the Nobel Peace Prize was willed for making peace between nations. The Norwegian Nobel Prize Committee just mindlessly, if expectedly, trying to promote expansionist NATO's anti-Putin agenda in the face of nuclear Armageddon." Now, bear in mind that some Nobel Peace Prize winners have proven highly controversial, not least former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, whom some accuse of war crimes. But on the opposite end of the spectrum are Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela, who few, if no one, can say did not foster true peace during their time. Inarguably, though, this prize is influential. So here now to discuss this year's winners and their potential impact are from Milan, Sergei Davidis. He is the head of the Political Prisoners Program at the Memorial Human Rights Center in Moscow, one of the organizations awarded this year's Nobel Peace Prize. Congratulations. From Moscow, we have Sergey Markov, former deputy of Russia's State Duma, and a professor at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. And from Oslo, we have Henrik Urdal, a director at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. Thanks all so much for being with us. Sergei Davidis, I'll start with you. Congratulations again. And if I understand correctly, it was our interview producer who actually first notified you of this win. What did you think when you heard that Memorial won the Nobel Peace Prize?
Oh, for sure, I feel proud, pride and joy. And for sure, it's important not only for us and mainly not for us, because for sure there are a lot of people fighting for peace now, but it's important that a sign of acceptance of this part of Russian society which withstand the war, fight the war, fight for democracy and human rights, and uniting three organizations from three countries in this award is also very important, because it means that human rights and democracy and peace do not have borders.
Right. You mentioned the acceptance, the recognition, as you say, of this part of Russian society that you are a part of, but as you know, this is not the kind of attention the Kremlin actually wants. Do you fear any consequences because of that?
Unfortunately, in our current situation, everything can happen, but our position is constant and cannot be changed by any threats. For sure, we stand for peace. We stand against war, and some of us who speaks out publicly are out of country, like me. So I can afford not to be afraid of the threats.
Okay. I mean, then tell us what will Memorial do now that it's won this kind of prestigious prize? How will you use it for the peaceful means it was intended for?
Memorial's huge family of organizations and communities. So it's not only one organization. It's a lot of organizations and people. So it should be discussed. And for sure, we haven't had time yet.
Okay. But I'm sure you will go forward very pragmatically. Henrik, let me ask you then, were you pleased, with the outcome of this year's award? And how do you think, or how do you hope at least, it will foster peace?
Well, first of all, congratulations to Mr. Davidis and Memorial, and to the other winners, Bialiatski and the Center for the Civil Liberties. I think this is both an important prize and a very well-deserved prize for organizations working systematically to promote human rights in their home countries and to document and provide evidence for human rights abuses and potential war crimes. So I think this was an important prize. I think it was a prize that in many ways there was the expectation that there has to be a focus on the war in Ukraine, which is now one of the major humanitarian situations globally, and one, of course, that's also on Norway's doorstep. So I think it was a good prize and an important prize.
One of the criteria, however, Henrik, is for the prize is to make peace between nations. Some see this as antagonizing a nation and actually derailing peace instead. What do you say to them?
So we know, and we as a research organization is of course careful to make sure that at least the observations that we make are reflecting what we know systematically about peace and conflict. And what we do know is that countries that are democratic and that respect basic human rights are more stable long term. Then I think it is also in the context of the war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine important to say that I don't think that a democratic democratic Russia respecting human rights would have invaded Ukraine the way it did.
Henrik, I just have to ask you one final question. Sergey Markov, I'm not ignoring you. I will get to you right now, but just a detail, Henrik. Some are pointing out that it coincided with Putin's 70th birthday today. Was that in any way deliberate to make sure he knows exactly what possibly the Nobel Prize Committee thinks of his position?
It apparently also coincides with, as far as I know, the death day of Anna Politkovskaya, the journalist of Novaya Gazeta. I don't think this factored into the decision of the Nobel Committee at all. I would be very surprised if they were even, thinking of this. And I'm sure that the message comes across to Putin regardless. Fair
enough. Sergey Markov. Let me get to you now. Give me what will be the Russian perspective from you and what you make of this year's winners.
I worked for the memorial when it had been founded, and I worked very intensively with them, with such big figures like Arseniy Radinsky, Vyacheslav Igrunov, and others. We fight against Soviet communist system. We fight for democracy. We fight against political repression. But now situation totally changed. We've been against political repression. Sergei Davidis and another memorial activists now, they support political repression where? In Ukraine, where it's thousands of prisoners, political prisoners, where there's thousands of people have been killed by political repression. What they're doing? They support those political repression. We've been against totalitarian regimes. but Sergei Davidis in this memorial, they support totalitarian society which can be created artificially in Ukraine, which use clear neo-Nazis. Sergei Davidis support neo-Nazis. That's why he was awarded by this Nobel Prize. Everybody knows that Europe fighted against Russia and Vladimir Putin. That's why second years already they give this prize to the political opponents of Vladimir Putin. So in fact,
Sergei
they want to
Davidis,
Vladimir Putin that he is big guy.
I can see, Sergei Davidis, that you find some of what you heard somewhat laughable, but it is a predominant Russian perspective for those speaking on as advocates of the Kremlin. Go ahead.
It's so absurd that even funny, in spite of the fact that awful things happen in Ukraine because of Putin's aggression against Ukraine. Everywhere there are some human rights violations, and Ukrainian human rights organization, like Center for Civil Liberties, which is also awarded today, they are committed to human rights, and they document human rights violation inside Ukraine and support victims of human rights violation. But what Mr. Markov says, it's absolutely fake information. And we, Russian people, are responsible for our country. We are responsible for human rights inside our country. And it's especially important to stop this war of aggression, violating human rights both in Ukraine and in Russia.
Stop the war of aggression in the name of peace. Okay, Sergey Markov, I'm coming back to you, but I want to present this to you first. Let me just...
Can I ask a question?
Very quickly.
Very quickly. Ales Bialiatski, who had been killed by neo-Nazi who worked for the Ukrainian government. Do you say any words to support this victim? Dmitry Jangirov, who had been captured now by neo-Nazi Kiev regime and who is under the torture, who is political science. You told something about these victims of political repression. No, you shut up.
Sergey Markov, let
about Russian victims, about our people. We are responsible for our authorities and our state.
You are an international organization. You claim as an international organization.
Okay.
Our responsibility is situation with human rights inside the country.
Inside the country. Sergey Markov, let me put this to you. I want to bring it back to the Nobel Prize itself. You know, when asked if the prize was actually directed against Putin, the response was that it was for people and certain entities or institutions, not against anyone. But then they went on to say this. We'll listen to what was said.
The attention that Mr. Putin has drawn on himself that is relevant in this context is the way civil society and human rights advocates are being suppressed. And that is what we would like to address with this prize.
Okay, so Sergey Markov, do you accept that at all, that perhaps your president has brought some of this on himself?
It's demonization of Vladimir Putin, quite a moderate political leader. It's demonization by doing propaganda of those who conducting hybrid war against Russia. It's clear military propaganda in which Nobel Prize Committee taking place actively. And the problem why Russia sent its troops, it's exactly human rights problem. It's exactly because the human rights of the millions of people in Ukraine sharply violated by a repressive regime.
Okay.
Putin salvated his human rights activists, I would say, could protected by military after 8 years of the not successful negotiation. He has to protect the human rights of those people military.
Okay.
That's because such people as Memorial betrayed this ideal, and they closed their eyes during 8 years on the civil war in Ukraine, on the killing of thousands of people by Kiev repressive regime.
Sergei Davidis, let me come back to you.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
I wanted to say that it's absolute nonsense. The only reason of all the events we see from 2014 is Putin aggression, unlawful annexation of Crimea, and further aggression in Donbass. There was peaceful life before. There was no civil war. It's external aggression from Putin's regime.
Okay.
And only Putin and his supporters, like Mr. Markov, are responsible for human rights violations in Ukraine.
Let me come back to the issue of the prize being awarded, Sergei Davidis, because, you know, even if one does argue that this is a political decision, do you think it still sends a message, and could it influence, do you hope, leadership in Russia and Belarus? Or do you think that leadership can easily just tune this out?
For sure, it is important. Probably every decision of such level have some reasons which can be considered political, because decision to support human rights in other countries is also political somehow. And for sure, we understand that we were taken to this group of human rights organization because of our liquidations of our organizations as a symbol of Russian civil society fighting the war, refusing to give up to assaults of Putin's regime on civil society and human rights. And the prize is given not to us exactly, because we haven't managed to prevent the war. So actually, we probably do not worth are not worth to receive this prize. But we receive it on behalf of those who also now in prisons for the anti-oppositions, who like Vladimir Kara-Murza or Alexei Gorinov, like Alexei Navalny, who continues to speak out against the war, even from prison cell.
Okay. Henrik, let me come back to you. I want to look at, interestingly enough, just a few months ago, we actually had Alexandra Matvijuk. She's the chairperson of the Center for Civil Liberties. She was another co-winner of this year's prize. She actually had this to say about continuing the war with Russia, because as we know, the prize was intended for fostering peace between nations, but she made this point. Let's listen.
We have no choice. For Ukrainians, if you take all recent and sociological polls for past years, freedom is the most important value. So we will fight for our country, for our people, and for freedom.
So, Henrik, she's arguing really that freedom requires fighting. Is that what also represents the values of the Nobel Prize?
So this is not a prize for the, I think, legitimate defense that the Ukrainians are putting up against the Russian invasion. It's a prize for the civil society organizations that are working on the ground. And I would like to take an issue and respectfully disagree with Professor Markov on the background for the Russian invasion. And the International Court of Justice has said very clearly that the invasion was unlawful and dismisses the claim that that this was based on genocide in the Donbass region. So this is not something that's also being supported by the international courts. So it is important, I think, for Russia to acknowledge that this is being seen and criticized by the world community, and that it is important before we can see any sort of prospects for long-term peace and stability in the region, that Russia is ending its hostile actions in Ukraine.
Okay. Henrik, let me stick with you for 1 second, because, you know, we had to mention at the top of the show, of course, that Ales Bialiatski is the individual who received this year's prize, not an organization, but as an individual. How do you think or hope that this win will influence or change, hopefully for the better, his current position as someone of the opposition in Belarus? He's currently in prison.
Yes, Bialiatski has been working relentlessly for the human rights situation and for democratic reform in Belarus since the 1980s, and has been imprisoned a number of times, and most recently in July last year. I hope that this means that Lukashenko will release Bialiatski and allow him to come to Oslo to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, which he has deserved. Otherwise, the empty chair that he is going to leave on the podium will be a very strong signal to the world that Lukashenko and Belarus are not accepting any kind of critical questions, critical action, and that is fundamentally, I think, the issue here. It's not an issue of being, traitors in your own countries, but legitimately allowing people to speak their mind and to also criticize the governments, which is a absolutely fundamental aspect of human rights.
Fundamental aspect of human rights. Sergey Markov, I mean, do you have any thoughts then on whether Ales Bialiatski should be released?
As already mentioned, I don't. Sorry, it's just the Nobel Prize to those nations, Russia, Ukraine, who is also Russian, Belarusians, who are also Russians. It reflects the fact that Russia is the main target of those Euro-Atlantic civilizations which control this Nobel Prize. And also, dear colleagues, you should remember, more you're lying and ignoring reality, more we became more strong in our ideas that we are doing right thing. And that Nobel Prize, from our point of view, is those who support war and fighting. This representative of Ukrainian organization clearly say to her, go ahead, fighting, die for the Kiev regime. And so for those who are not against political repression, but who support political pressure. I already asked Sergei about specific names. I can ask about those who have been killed in Odessa on the May 2. Why you say nothing? Why say you nothing about prohibition of Russian language? This language of the majority of Ukrainian people, but it's prohibited. Why Memorial shut up about this sharp, clear, many years violation of human rights?
Again, we can see.
Not for, you got the Nobel Prize exactly for this, because you support political repression.
Sergei Davidis, go ahead.
We do not speak about it because the first thing that these are complete lies. There are difficulties, but not crimes. Everything you say. And the second issue is that even
everything.
When we speak about
Odessa who've been killed, it's lie.
Let Sergei Davidis finish, please.
You are lying always. And even if there are real human rights violations in other countries, we are not in situation to criticize Ukraine when our country, for which we are responsible, unleashes an unprovoked war against this country and kills people every day there. So for sure, we shall not speak about human rights in Ukraine until our military forces are there, even if there are real human rights violations.
Sergei Davidis, let me ask you this, because I did allude to this question at the top of the program when we started this debate.
Excuse me.
The issue that some people fear that giving this award to the organizations and individual that it was awarded to will actually just further antagonize the Kremlin and actually backfire potentially on not least, Ales Bialiatski, who sits in prison in Belarus. I just want to get your thoughts again on your fears going forward, but why you think, obviously, that it is worth the fight. It's worth receiving this award, even if there are negative consequences.
I do not think that sufficient negative consequences can take place just because human rights situation both in Russia and Belarus are so bad that it's rather difficult to worsen it. And we can hardly imagine that Nobel Prize will worsen this situation. Anyway, this prize attracts attention to those who get this prize. But as I already said, even much more important that it attracts attention to general situation in this country, to those who withstand the pressure from authoritarian states.
Okay. Sergey Markov, your thoughts?
Sergei Davidis, he's lying. He just told that he cannot talk about violation of human rights in Ukraine because it's another country.
With the perspective from Moscow, unfortunately, we're out of time. I greatly appreciate your perspective there. And Sergei Davidis in Milan, again, congratulations on this win. And of course, Henrik Urdal joining us from Oslo. Thanks all so much for being with us. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this edition of The Newsmakers. Our viewers, of course, remember you can follow us on Twitter and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.